Hi, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the MakdisiStreet podcast, joined as usual by my brothers Osama and Sadi in California. I want to remind, as we often do at the beginning of our session here, to please subscribe to the YouTube channel or to any of the podcasts at Apple or Spotify, wherever you're listening to this, and please put a 5-star review because it really helps other listeners find us. We also, again, as a reminder, we have launched our Patreon for those that want to support our YouTube or our podcast. We very much appreciate it. Again, the links are in the bio, and we encourage you to please check it out. Today, we're really pleased and happy to have Mouin Rabbani with us. Mouin is a very keen analyst and a commentator and a researcher who specializes in the contemporary Middle East, but also on the Arab-Israeli conflict and other areas like this, even on international affairs. He's served as the principal political affairs officer with the Office of the UN Special Envoy for Syria, the head of the Middle East with the Crisis Management Initiative, and a senior Middle East analyst and special advisor on Israel-Palestine with the International Crisis Group. Mouin is also now the co-editor of Jadaliyya, the contributing editor of the Middle East Report, and a senior fellow of the Institute for and an associate fellow of the European Council on Foreign Relations. He's also, I should add, a graduate of both Tufts University and Georgetown, both of which are my alma maters. So welcome, Mouin, to the MakdisiStreet podcast.
Thank you very much, Kareem and Osama and Sadi. Very nice to be with you.
So, Mouin, we usually start these podcasts with if you could just kind of introduce yourself a little bit more in terms of your journey into understanding and kind of analyzing the Middle East and Palestine more generally.
Well, I was born in the Netherlands to two Palestinian parents who were both made refugees as a result of the establishment of the Israeli state in 1948. Since you mentioned you want to discuss the recent developments in the International Criminal Court, I grew up literally a stone's throw from where the ICC is currently located, down the street from there. And I would say I grew up in a very politically engaged household. And I think that would explain why I had absolutely no interest in this issue as a young child, because to me, it kind of meant, why my parents always either had people over or were busy with the cause, so to speak. I mean, they're both wonderful parents, but I think like any child, you want the attention devoted solely to yourself. And then when I became a teenager, I started reading more and more about it and became more and more interested. And it was in that context that I also began to study it more intensively when I went to university, to the extent that when I finished my master's, I had been accepted into a PhD program, and I had intended to study Middle East history. And although one can't travel back in time, one can travel across space. And having never lived in the Middle East, I thought before I commence my doctoral studies, I should at least live in the region. And I applied for a temporary teaching position at a number of Palestinian universities in the West Bank. This was in November of 1987, when you still had to send letters through the postal service. And just for good measure, at the encouragement of several friends, I also applied to become a researcher at a human rights organization in Ramallah named Al-Haq, the West Bank affiliate of the International Commission of Jurists. Well, as it happened, by the time my letters arrived, the first intifada had erupted. The Israeli military had shut down all the universities. And so none of the universities I applied to had any use for my services, while human rights organizations all of a sudden had a real need to expand their staff. And so in mid 1988, I arrived in Palestine for the first time. I should say I was only able to go there because I'm a Dutch citizen. I would have never gotten in as a Palestinian, and spent 2 years there at that point. So that's kind of the long and short of it. And then, after that, I've probably devoted most of my professional career engaged with either Palestine or the Middle East more broadly in one capacity or another.
Okay, fantastic. So I thought we would start today just because it's sort of fresh off the boat. The kind of just the ruling of the International Criminal Court that Karim Khan, the head of the ICC, just kind of came out with these arrest warrants after 8 months or so of the carnage and kind of genocide in Gaza. I know you've written a lot about the ICC, and you wrote a very really good piece in Past Blue that I saw. Co-authored, yes. And so the question is, how should we understand this ruling of the International Criminal Court? I mean, is this something that we should think of as historic? I think Francesca Albanese, I just saw an interview with her, and she was saying, with the critique, but she was saying, look, this is something that's really historic in the sense it's the first time. And so it puts a certain kind of pressure. Or as I think a lot of other people are thinking about, this is the way in which it came out, the delays in which this kind of came out, and the fact that, in a sense, they put arrest warrants for 3 Palestinian leaders as opposed to just the 2 Israelis. How do we assess it, and how can we best contextualize it?
Well, I think both assessments are correct. It is historic. It is a milestone, but that doesn't also mean that the way that the prosecutor, Karim Khan, that doesn't also mean that the way he is engaged with this issue has been extremely problematic. We need to remember Palestine applied to become a state party to the International Criminal Court in 2015. That application, I believe, was accepted finally in 2019. Then in early 2021, the pre-trial chamber confirmed to Khan's predecessor, Fatou Bensouda, that the office of the prosecutor does have jurisdiction, which means that the ICC can prosecute any violation of the Rome Statute committed by any Palestinian, because Palestine is a member state, in addition to any crime by anyone committed on the territory of the state of Palestine. And on that basis, in early 2021, the investigation supposedly commenced. Now, the other thing to bear in mind is that the investigation did not start looking at violations of the Rome Statute committed from 2021 onwards, but rather from 2014 onwards. So the first thing that struck me about the applications for arrest warrants that were issued yesterday is that for Karim Khan too, history began on October 7th. He has supposedly been investigating international crimes committed pursuant to the Rome Statute since 2014. But he has said nothing, for example, about the crime of apartheid. He has said nothing about the war crime of the illegal establishment and expansion of settlements. He had nothing to say about Israel's systematic use of snipers against demonstrators during the 2018 March of Return. He had nothing to say about Israel's previous onslaughts on the Gaza Strip, most notably 2014 Operation Protective Edge, it was called, if I recall correctly. And at least thus far, these issues, which he has supposedly been investigating for years and for much longer than he has been investigating the current situation in the Gaza Strip, is met with absolute silence. And I think there's a reason for this, is that he wanted to appear balanced, as taking the considerations of his main sponsors, the US and the UK, into account. And that's why, as you mentioned, I believe he issued more applications against Palestinians than against Israelis. So, having said that, I do think it is a historic milestone, given the way that Israel, since its establishment, particularly in the West, and especially in Europe, has used the crimes committed against Jews in Europe, culminating in the Holocaust, as a shield to shield itself from any criticism or condemnation for what it is doing in real time since 1947-48 against the Palestinian people. And I think if you take these indictments together with the current case in the International Court of Justice, where South Africa is now plausibly accusing Israel of committing the crime of crimes, genocide, that shield no longer has any effectiveness. I think now people who have traditionally given Israel the benefit of the doubt and looked at Israeli actions through the prism of what Germany did to the Jews in the 1940s, for example, will now be much more willing and able to look at Israel through the prism of what it is doing in real time to the Palestinian people. So in that sense, I think the assessment that this is a historic milestone, as Francesca Albanese and others have suggested, is entirely correct. But again, there are very serious problems. If you look at the crimes that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his defense minister Yoav Gallant are accused of, well, what about the other members of Israel's war cabinet who fully participated in the decision-making process and are as responsible for these decisions as these two characters are? What about the chief of the general staff? What about the military commanders who are directly responsible for implementing these crimes that are in the application? And, why is there no mention of genocide? And I don't buy the argument that he's not dealing with genocide because the International Court of Justice is, for the simple reason that the International Court of Justice adjudicates disputes between states. The International Court of Justice does not get into the issue of personal criminal responsibility. That's what the ICC does. So he has a clear responsibility. Now, I know there have been statements made that the prosecutor is in the process of preparing additional applications for arrest warrants. That's all well and good. But again, I think it demonstrates that he's the consummate politician. If I can just make one other point, there's an element here of background that I think is very important to note. You mentioned the article that I had co-authored with Hasmik Egan in Pass Blue. Hasmik Egan was a director of the UN Security Council Affairs Department in 2021 when Karim Khan made his first briefing to the Security Council in that particular case about the ongoing investigation into Libya. And during that briefing, Khan 3 times went out of his way to reassure the Security Council that under his leadership, the ICC prosecutor would only focus on those cases that had been referred to his office by the Security Council, meaning essentially Libya and Sudan Darfur, while no longer dealing with other cases that had not come to him through the Security Council. And this was a specific reference to the investigation into Afghanistan and into Palestine, which neither the US nor the UK nor Israel wanted to see pursued. And in that context, he basically filed them away and hoped that they would disappear. His problem was that the following year, Russia invaded Ukraine, and almost from the moment the first Russian soldiers set foot on Ukrainian territory, Khan was already in Kiev announcing an investigation and putting together a team and all the rest of it. And lo and behold, within a year, he had issued an application for the arrest of not only senior Russian officials, but the head of state of a permanent member of the Security Council, Russian President Vladimir Putin. So in that context, the hypocrisy became a little too overwhelming. You said you're only going to deal with Security Council referrals. You're now indicting the head of state of a permanent member of the Security Council, but somehow you're no longer pursuing the investigation into Palestine. And I think the second challenge to his inertia that he was unable to overcome was the growing global clamor since October of 2023 for him to actually do something, as I used to put it, to stop decorating his Christmas tree in midsummer and to take some serious actions with respect to the situation in Palestine.
So, Mouin, on that point, on that very point, I was going to ask you what's changed. In other words, somebody who sounds like Karim Khan, who sounds, as you're describing him, as essentially a political animal, in the sense that he's very aware of where the balance of power lies, and he's going to do his best to sort of navigate the application of international law to the balance of power, which favors militarily and politically, of course, the United States and Israel. So what's changed? In other words, why would he now care about international opinion and global outrage at the genocide? So that's one question. And the second question, if I could ask, is, does it actually matter what the ICC does, in the sense that the Israelis seem to be dead set, pursuing this genocide and the invasion of Rafah and the making of Palestinian life miserable, no matter what the ICC does? And the U.S. outrage yesterday, the extraordinary statements of both Biden and Blinken against the ICC, sort of tells us that perhaps we shouldn't put too much faith in the outcome of the ICC.
Yeah. Well, in response to your first question, I think Khan backed himself into a corner with the way he dealt with the Ukraine investigation, in the sense that his principle that he would only deal with Security Council referrals became untenable once he began investigating Russian crimes in the Ukraine. And I think the second issue is that it was not just pro-Palestinian demonstrators in London and New York who were calling for him to take actions. If you look at the statements that have been made over the course of the past 6 months or so, basically his peers, many of the leading luminaries in international law and in the international justice system, have been openly and publicly calling on him to get on the case and to take action. And so not only was the credibility and legitimacy of the court and his office being called into question, but him personally. And I think it's in that context that he felt he needed to act. And I think you're entirely correct, Osama, for describing him as a consummate politician. And frankly, my expectation had been that he would seek to indict a slew of Hamas leaders, and then, as the US and European countries have done, throw out a few indictments of individual extremist West Bank settlers as well. He didn't do that because he is apparently not yet ready to deal with the broader issues here and Israeli conduct in the West Bank. And so he did issue these applications with regard to Netanyahu and Gallant. On the one hand, they're extremely justified and substantiated. At the same time, I think you could also make the cases these two have become kind of global bête noire, and it's much easier to go after them than, for example, the darling of the U.S. political establishment, Benny Gantz, or some of these others. Could you remind me your second question?
The second question is, why does it matter? Given the fact that, like, why should we put any stock in what the ICC does, given what Israel and the US and their reaction, their extraordinarily negative reaction?
Well, these are hugely, I think, politically, first of all, but also legally significant cases. If you're going to judge their significance by whether or not Netanyahu is extradited to The Hague, put in trial, and ends his day in the same prison cell that Milosevic formerly occupied, yes, then it is a charade, because I think we can already agree that's never going to happen. But I think, first of all, the US and UK reaction, and that of some of Israel's other sponsors, are significant because they are exposing themselves as demonstrating once again, that all their paeans to international law, to human rights, to democracy promotion and all that are basically smoke and mirrors and entirely meaningless and empty of substance. It's how the rules-based international order works. The rules are for you, and I decide the order. International law is sacrosanct when it comes to the conduct of our enemies and adversaries. But when it's us or our friends, the only principle that counts is impunity, and we can do as we please. But again, getting back to your question, I think, on the one hand, the US and the UK have made themselves something of a global laughingstock. You now have actually, I had to be corrected on this point because I didn't realize this, but the US yesterday came out not only against the ICC applications for the arrest of Netanyahu and Gallant, it also rejects the applications that Khan is seeking against the 3 Hamas leaders. That's how extreme they are, that basically they're willing to give Hamas a pass in order to defend Israel on the baseless foundation that the ICC does not have jurisdiction over this case.
But Mouin, is it that? Sorry to interrupt. Is it that, or is it the Israeli assumption and the American assumption that they want to kill these 3 people? And so,
well, it's both. But I mean, to say that as a matter of principle, the ICC does not have a right to issue arrest warrants against Yahya Sinwar and Mohammed Dif and Ismail Haniya, because the ICC has no jurisdiction over the situation in Palestine. They never made this argument against, in the case of Russia and Ukraine, but when it comes to promoting and preserving Israeli impunity, there is no extreme to which the American leadership and political class will not go to defend Israel. And again, yes, you can criticize and condemn, as you well should, but more importantly, I think it makes the U.S. nothing less than a global laughingstock. But just to get back to the question again, I think, given the extraordinary impunity Israel has always enjoyed, to simply see it challenged in fora like the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court is, I think, of extraordinarily huge political significance. So again, I'm not looking at this case about whether these individuals are genuinely going to be held accountable in any legal sense of the word. That's not how the world works, and that's not going to happen. But the political impact, I think, is a bombshell.
There's also just to add to Osama's, to answer also Osama's question, although I have a question for Mouin too. There's also, Mouin is getting to this just now. There's also what Richard Falk calls the legitimacy struggle too. This is a major blow to the legitimacy of the Israeli state. And I think that also has vast political implications, no matter where this case actually goes. But Mouin, to come back to the issue itself, and we have many other things to talk about, so we should move on, fairly quickly. But just on this particular point, So technically, it's not that Karim Khan has issued these arrest warrants. He's applied for the issuing, right? So now it still rests on. So there's massive political pressure on him at the behest of Tel Aviv and Washington. And now, of course, I can't remember the three other judges. I don't know who they are.
Pre-trial chamber, it's called.
Yeah. So those people, presumably now they're under massive pressure from the usual sources, right? So hopefully they're going to stand up to the pressure. But of course, it introduces a weak link. I mean, I wonder. I don't want to be too conspiratorial here, but I wonder whether Karim Khan is sort of passing the potato. Basically, now it's in the lap of these guys, and who knows what they're going to do.
It is a standard procedure under the ICC's procedure. The prosecutor is not empowered to simply issue arrest warrants. He has to seek their approval from a 3-judge panel that's called a pre-trial chamber. And while I completely understand your concerns, and while I fully agree with you that massive pressure is being exercised as we speak, I think the problem for those exercising this pressure is that there are very clear standards and criteria by which the pretrial chamber is obliged to judge the prosecutor's application. So if they reject these without providing overwhelmingly persuasive reasons for doing so, I think we can pretty much consign the ICC to the dustbin of history.
That's. I mean, hopefully that they'll withstand the pressure and come through. But then the other question is, well, whatever pressure he's been, both Khan and these other people have been under, it's like, in for a penny, in for a pound, right? So at this point, he's a marked man, right? So he might as well now go all in, and as you're saying, indict the rest of all of the the crew of genocidal maniacs that run the Israeli state, right?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point because, we've not only seen, there's not only the kinds of pressures that you're referring to, we've seen it very openly, from some of these crazies in the U.S. Congress openly making all kinds of threats against the prosecutor, the ICC, its staff, their families. I mean, this is Soprano stuff that they're engaging in. But the interesting thing now is, I think there's two interesting points. First of all, if you again look at how Khan has operated, indicting more Palestinians than Israelis, for example, and some of these other issues, I suspect he thought that doing so would earn him some brownie points in Washington. And it's earned him, of course, nothing but their vicious attacks. So then we get to the second point, which is that these brazen attempts to interfere with the proper operations of the ICC are in and of themselves criminal violations of the Rome Statute. So it will now be interesting.
So is there any chance, like technically, could he now issue warrants for these senators and whatnots in Washington? I mean, that would be truly.
He's entirely empowered to do so. I suspect he won't, but it'll be a very interesting. If they go way overboard, they may leave him with no choice but to defend himself. And yeah, that could be in a very interesting scenario.
But Mouin, why don't you remind our listeners, if an American is in fact sent off to The Hague, what kind of legislation is in place by the U.S. Congress? Since you're a national there, and stone's throw from The Hague, maybe you can remind everybody what's in store.
Yeah, just a personal anecdote. I not only grew up a stone's throw from the International Criminal Court, I also grew up a stone's throw from Scheveningen prison, which is the Dutch prison whose facilities have been generously offered to the ICC to keep their suspects and convicts. It's where Milosevic died. It's where some of these other criminals are now being held. And in 2002, the U.S. Congress passed a piece of legislation that's popularly known as the Hague Invasion Act. which gives the US government the authority to order the US armed forces to basically invade the Netherlands and retrieve, I think it's American nationals, but it may also refer to allied.
They want allies. John Bolton just tweeted that he wants it to expand, and they've been trying to push that it expands to allies, meaning basically the Israelis.
Yes, that US armed forces can basically invade the sovereign territory of a NATO member in order to retrieve accused or convicted war criminals that are being held by either the ICC or its prison system. And this gets back, of course, to the U.S.-Israeli rejection of the principle of the Rome Statute and the International Criminal Court, because once again, international law, accountability, and such are principles that only apply to others, not to us.
Sadi, you said you had another question, Sadi, or you?
No, I think Mouin answered it. Just, I mean, I think we're all on the same page now about the ICC. Hopefully, Karim Khan, who, as we were saying, is clearly or has been to date a political creature, is now. I think he's realized he's in it now, so he might as well just go all the way because he's got nothing else to lose at this point. And I think it is. I mean, as Mouin is saying, I think it's a major blow to the legitimacy of the Israeli state.
Yeah, but Sadi, just sorry to interrupt, Sadi, but just to add this, because I think Mouin was also alluding to this. Maybe I think he was, which is that I'm not sure I agree with you. I mean, he's gone after these two Israeli figures, Netanyahu and Gallant, who are from a particular political party and a particular fringe that the kind of more liberal-leaning people in the United States and others are kind of annoyed with. So he did not issue these applications.
Yeah, but it still is the prime minister and the defense minister.
It's the prime minister.
This isn't like Smotrich and Ben Gvir. This is
right. It's shocking in that sense, but at the same time, it's a particular thing. So they haven't, it hasn't gone into the other guys on the other side that are saying pretty much exactly the same thing. And so. And the head of the IDF, for that matter.
Can I just make one more point about this entire case that I think is worth mentioning? What people don't realize is that it's actually because of Hamas that we've gotten to where we are today. As you may recall, in 2013, 2014, 2015, the Palestinian president, Mahmoud Abbas, was coming under increasing pressure and criticism from Palestinian human rights organizations, Palestinian lawyers, Palestinians more general, for dragging his feet on submitting an application to the International Criminal Court for Palestinian membership in that court. And the reason he was dragging his feet was because he was getting all kinds of threats from the Americans and the Israelis about, there will be hell to pay if you do this. Finally, the pressure on Abbas from his domestic constituency became too overwhelming to resist, and he finally felt that he was left with no choice but to ignore the American, Israeli, and European, I should add, threats, and that he had to capitulate to the demands of his own people. But before doing so, and recognizing that if Palestine became an ICC member, that also opened up the prospect that the ICC could be indicting and convicting Palestinians, he insisted that he would only submit the Palestinian application to the ICC if Hamas and Islamic Jihad explicitly endorsed it. So he threw the ball in Hamas's court, and he basically told Hamas, unless you support the application, I'm not going to submit it. And Hamas did, in fact, formally, explicitly endorse the Palestinian application to join the International Criminal Court. Had they not done so, Abbas would not have submitted the application. There would have been no investigation into Palestine, and we wouldn't have seen these applications for arrest that we saw this week. And it's also the case that Hamas has consistently over the past decade called on the ICC to speed up its investigation. And in fact, even though previous investigations, such as the Goldstone Commission and others, have condemned not only Israel but also Hamas, despite that, Hamas has in fact, to the best of my knowledge, never blocked efforts by international human rights investigations or UN commissions or others to investigate war crimes and crimes against humanity in this situation, including that committed by Palestinians. So I think we also need to point out that it's the Palestinians, whether the Palestinian Authority or Hamas, that have consistently been urging on these investigations, while it is those who sanctimoniously pontificate about the rule of law and human rights 24/7, the United States, the Europeans, and of course Israel, who from the outset have categorically rejected these investigations and now also the outcome of these investigations.
Okay, great. So this is actually you're transitioning into where we wanted to push the conversation as well, which is on the question of these last 7-8 months and the context for it. So you've mentioned now kind of Hamas and the Palestinian Authority and their acceptance of these international fora, in fact, and before that, maybe at some point we bring up the conversation about how Hamas, in a sense, had accepted at least the basic principles of the two-state solution, several years back. So this idea of Hamas having become, at least tactically, I don't know, strategically, maybe tactically, maybe actually more pragmatic in its approach, and then how there's this kind of abrupt halt, in part, that sort of begins on October 7th, in part because nobody was taking the Palestinians seriously, even with all these concessions. So all the concessions that we've spoken about in this podcast before, on the question of the Oslo peace process, this kind of attempt, okay, no armed struggle, okay, negotiation, okay, we accept, this much and this much. But, each time they keep on shifting the goalposts and the Palestinians get less and less and less and never really a state. And then, of course, the facts on the ground. And so this idea, one could certainly in retrospect, if not at the time, say that the Oslo process was all kind of an exercise in delay to deepen the occupation and deepen annexation and, deepen what I think my brothers agree is a kind of eventual ethnic cleansing. And here we are at this kind of process. But so the question of shifting into this kind of post-October 7, where this armed struggle or the armed resistance or violence or however one wants to term these things is back on the table. And has this huge impact, right? It has an impact in the regional sense. It has impact on the international sense. I mean, mobilizing the ICJ, mobilizing the ICC, a central topic in international politics, all the way to U.S. campuses, protests in Europe, across the world. All of this sort of was focused back into what Hamas did, in this act. So I wanted to push us a little bit and ask you not so much to dwell on October 7th, because we sort of, but more on in these last several months, how you assess the kind of military and the strategic side of what's happening. Because we've been debating with my brothers and I for a long time about, militarily, the Israelis kind of putting these objectives and sort of like they did in 2006 and not really being able to do that. And strategically, how do you see this militarily? How do you see this?
Well, I think it's a very interesting question. I would start by saying that armed resistance to Israel and Israeli occupation never really went off the table. I mean, you had the Second Intifada, you had the 2006 war with Lebanon, where Hezbollah fought Israel to a standstill. And then, of course, in recent years, you've had kind of an ongoing low-level insurgency in the West Bank, particularly in the Nablus and Jenin areas of the northern West Bank. But you have, on the whole, had calm and quiet, with few exceptions, in the Gaza Strip. What I think the strategic significance of the past 8 months has been is that I think that for many people in the region, Palestinians and others, it has demonstrated that there is, in fact, a viable military option against Israel, in the sense that, we're not talking about a 35-day war as you had in 2006, but the idea that the Israeli military is actually much weaker than it had been assumed to be in terms of being an effective fighting force. The idea that you have Hamas, which at the end of the day is really a second-order militia using primarily locally manufactured rudimentary weaponry, and 8 months on is still able to effectively confront the Israeli military machine, I think for many people will have shown that, well, actually, Israel is military vulnerable. There is an option of wearing Israel down with a prolonged war of attrition. Of course, the flip side of that is that there's nothing left of the Gaza Strip. I mean, the entire territory has been reduced to rubble. Tens of thousands have been killed, to the extent that Israel is now plausibly accused of genocide and all the rest of it. But if I take your question in the very narrow sense, I would argue that it has put the military option back on the table, particularly when you look at it in a regional aspect, that it's not only Hamas that has proven it can resist the Israeli military machine for 8 months, but you also have what's going on in the Israeli-Lebanese border zone, in the Red Sea, and elsewhere.
So, Mouin, on this point, so we often debate amongst ourselves this question, as you're saying, that the Israelis have been waging this sort of war of this devastating war, this genocide on Gaza. And the question is it really, I mean, how can you help us think through this question of, was the point of the war to defeat Hamas, as the Israelis constantly say, and of course to free their hostages, as they also constantly proclaim, or was it actually simply to destroy and make Palestinian life untenable? And so in that sense, how do we, so we debate, there's always a sense that Israel is not winning the war in terms of its political objectives, but isn't the political objective, in fact, to make Palestinian life impossible, to make the Gaza Strip uninhabitable? And so how do you figure that into a strategic analysis of everything since October 7th?
Well, I would argue that Israel has multiple objectives. I do think that Israel not only genuinely intended, but also genuinely believed it could thoroughly crush Hamas. And when you look at it from Israel's perspective, of course, it wanted to wipe out Hamas, given that for the first time since 1949, Israel had to, fight on its home turf, so to speak. So, to me, it's clear as daylight that eradicating Hamas, or at least its military capabilities, was an Israeli strategic objective from the first day, as was eliminating Hamas's ability to continue governance of the Gaza Strip. As you may recall, retrieving the captives from the Gaza Strip is something that came later, primarily in response to domestic, public, and international pressure, because I think, as many people have said, and as I think Israel's leaders understood, there's somewhat of an inherent contradiction between prosecuting a war against the Gaza Strip and retrieving captives, which can only be done through negotiations. But I also agree that obliterating the Gaza Strip was an equally important war objective. Israel has this obsession with what it calls deterrence, meaning that any adversary will be simply too fearful of launching an attack or a war against Israel, because the cost of doing so will be too great to bear. And I think if you look at what Israel has been doing to the Gaza Strip, it's very obviously, in my mind, geared towards making an example of the Palestinians. It's making an example of the Gaza Strip, not only to intimidate the Palestinians, but also anyone who's watching. If you even think of raising your head, if you even think of doing something against us, this is what's going to happen to you. And then
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say that the third objective, the ethnic cleansing of the Gaza Strip, has been a long-term Israeli objective. It's older than the Israeli occupation of the Gaza Strip. Already in the 1950s, Israel began proposing various initiatives to, quote unquote, thin out the population of the Gaza Strip, for the simple reason that 3/4 of the population of the Gaza Strip consists of Palestinian refugees who were ethnically cleansed in 1948 and their descendants. And I think Israel saw these people as forming an intrinsic threat right on its borders. And so you had all kinds of proposals, ship them off to Libya, ship them off to Iraq, ship them off to Paraguay, and whatnot. And I think that on October 7th, in the context of the unqualified, unconditional Western support that Israel got, it saw an opportunity to basically push these people into the desert, into the Sinai Peninsula. And it's, in fact, a proposal that the U.S. Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, for one, openly embraced and tried to market to the U.S.'s Arab client regimes. Funnily enough, their most dependent and dependable Arab partners all rejected it out of hand, and that became thereafter an untenable proposition. So the fallback option is to make the Gaza Strip unfit for human habitation, and hoping that these people eventually start leaving in manners similar to what we've been seeing along the North African coast or between Turkey and Greece over the past decade.
But even that, Mouin, I mean, like even the project to ethnically cleanse. I mean, yes, it's true that, I mean, who knows where we're going to go in the future? But so far, what all that the Israelis have managed to do is to inflict incalculable harm and to kill, as you're saying, tens of thousands of people and destroy the housing and the hospitals and the universities and just make life miserable. But there's the flip side to it, which you've adverted to, are the costs that are also being incurred by the Israelis. The costs that the Israelis are also carrying, right? And by which I mean not just their own military casualties, but also the cost of their economy, the cost, which now comes back to the ICC and the ICJ, the political cost, the cost in terms of their own legitimacy as a state project. All of those things are now suddenly on the agenda in a way that they have not been for as far as I can't remember a time when Israel's very legitimacy was as much at stake as it is right now, right? For all of these reasons. So in a way, yes, they've done this incredibly inhuman destruction to the people in Gaza, but it seems to me they're not going to be able to destroy Hamas. They're killing huge numbers of people and making life miserable, but they're not actually ethnically cleansing, but they're not able to because people are remaining steadfast. They're not going. And it's almost as though, so let's follow this through, because who knows none of us, we're not in a position to predict where we're going to go next here, historically speaking. But it's almost as though like the real solution now, because of what the Israelis have done and because of the extent to which their own legitimacy as a state project is now at stake, it's almost easier in a way to imagine the people in Gaza, 80% of whom, as you say, are refugees from elsewhere in Palestine. It's almost easier to imagine them going home as a solution, precisely because Israel will have rendered Gaza effectively uninhabitable for the foreseeable future. And I don't know. Do you think is that too far off the charts? Or given all of the alignments that we're talking about here, is it even on the table for conversation?
Well, I think if you look at this from the Israeli perspective, rather than, let's say, from an objective, rational perspective of someone assessing this from outside, I don't think the Israelis see an unbearable cost, or at least not yet, in the sense that um, impunity for them is a given. And the idea that they're ever going to have to pay a price for their actions or be held accountable for them is entirely foreign to them. Remember, we're talking about a state whose leaders have been doing as they please for decades. So I think even issues we've been talking about today, the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal, I think that has yet to sink in, and then when you talk about Israel's legitimacy as a state becoming increasingly questioned, I think they look at all these demonstrations on university campuses in the U.S. and elsewhere, and they basically see, as far as they're concerned, a bunch of Hamas mobs who were thankfully being beaten into the ground by the forces of law and order. So I don't, yes, objectively, I think many of the points you're making are correct, but I don't think, not only do I not think that Israel's leaders see it that way, I don't think they're capable of applying rational, objective criteria to assess their own predicament. I think it's going to take a very
100%. Yeah, that 100%. I agree with you, but that doesn't mean that it's not going to happen, right? That's like, in other words, we're also agreeing. I think you and I agree fundamentally here, and my brothers to some extent. Although this is part of what we argue about. I mean, I think whatever, it doesn't matter who's agreeing. The point is that they thought in their minds they're going to go into Gaza and they're going to smash Hamas, and in 2 weeks or whatever, as they've done in previous operations, and be done. And obviously that's not what's happening, right? Because of the extent of the resistance they're facing. Just as they thought in 2006 they're going to go to Lebanon and smash Hezbollah and smash everything and have their way, which also didn't turn out. And so there are all these. So I think you're right, Mouin, that they are incapable of rational judgment. I mean, going back in a separate wavelength, if you go back to the so-called peace process in Oslo and so forth, it would have been, rationally speaking, it would have been in their interest to say, okay, we accept this so-called Palestinian state in the West Bank, which would have been those disconnected bits and pieces, that archipelago of land, and be done with it. That way, I mean, it would have been a smart move for them to have done, because Abbas would have accepted it. They could have washed their hands of this whole thing in a way. But I think you're right. They're not capable of making those kinds of rational calculations, which doesn't mean that there isn't a price, and maybe even in some sense the ultimate price for them to pay, right? I mean, can we say that too? What do you think?
By ultimate price, you basically mean the dismantling of the Israeli state.
Yeah, I mean, if we say the legitimacy of the Israeli state is sufficiently called into question, that is what people are demanding: the end of apartheid, the end of occupation, the dismantling of this racial regime of violence. I'm not saying it's going to happen tomorrow, but it is at some point, however remote it may seem at some point, it is on the table for discussion, right?
Well, I would make several points. First of all, just getting back to the earlier part of our discussion, I do think that Netanyahu has fairly effectively been put forward as the bogeyman and the fount of all evil, with everything you dislike about Israel. In other words, I still think there's quite a broad spectrum of people who distinguish between the Netanyahu they hate and the Israel they love, and who believe if we can only get rid of this craven bastard, if you could put it this way, things will go back to normal. I mean, they don't remember that under what's his name, Lapid, and the other clown, Bennett, things were basically unchanged. And so while I do think that Israel's legitimacy, or as it's increasingly being proposed, the legitimacy of the Zionist project is increasingly being called into question, I do still think that for many people who are now fiercely critical of what's going on, they would still like to believe there is a genuine distinction to be made between Netanyahu and the Israeli state. That would be my first point. The second one, I think, has more to do with the region. I've always, or I have been of the view that there is no practical obstacle to a two-state settlement, that if there was sufficient political will, Israel can either withdraw or be forced to withdraw to the 1967 boundaries, and that an independent Palestinian state could be established in the territories occupied by Israel in 1967. I continue to believe that's the case, but what I think Israel has done in the past 8 months is raised a much more fundamental question, that for many people in the region who have been prepared to accept a two-state settlement for any number of reasons, have they now come to the conclusion that coexistence with this irrational, genocidal apartheid state is a non-starter, and that a two-state settlement, even if it's feasible, is no longer desirable? And in that sense, that the legitimacy question has trumped everything else, particularly if you take into account that I think for many people in the region, they have come to the conclusion that one thing that Hamas and Hezbollah and Houthis and others have demonstrated over the past year is that there potentially is a viable military option against Israel.
So, Mouin, on that point, when you say, let me play devil's advocate for a second, and when you say that the Israelis are acting irrationally, or what's irrational about an Israeli project that is making Gaza unlivable, that is inflicting massive harm on the Palestinians, that has acted rationally in the sense of knowing that the West overwhelmingly has supported Israel? And the United States policy today is vastly more pro-Zionist at the official level than it's ever been, frankly. I mean, we've never seen such extraordinary support for Israel in the middle of even Reagan and others. There's a point where they say enough is enough. Biden has no red lines vis-a-vis the Palestinians. You can do whatever you want. You can't go to war with Iran necessarily, but with the Palestinians, you can do what you want, and we're going to supply you with all the weapons. Why is that irrational? Can you explain that to us, or to our viewers and listeners? What's irrational about the fact of a state that has acted with total impunity and given Western support in that impunity? What's irrational about that?
Well, I think at one level, you raise a valid point, and perhaps it's premature to give a definitive response on this issue. But if in the coming years, it is confirmed that what has happened during the past 8 months does represent a genuine turning point, and that the unconditional support that Israel has received for behaving without any restraints whatsoever is going to cause significant changes in Western policy towards Israel, yes, then it will have been irrational. I mean, you mentioned Biden. I think it's ever since Johnson, I believe, that every time a U.S. president leaves office, he's praised as the best friend Israel has ever had in the White House. That was certainly true of Trump, and is now even more true of Biden. I think perhaps for the first time, the next U.S. president, even if it's Trump again, is going to have difficulty being characterized as the best friend Israel has ever had in the White House after what the services that Biden has provided. But to get back to your point, I mean, look at Israel's position in the United States today. What you're saying about the White House and the State Department and so on is 100% correct. But Israel's greatest strategic asset and the mainstay of its support has always been the solid bipartisan support than it has enjoyed in the United States political system. And you know as well as I do that the mainstay of Israel's support traditionally used to be not the conservative Republicans, but the liberal Democrats. Now look at where it is. And this is not only because of the last 8 months, of course not, but, Israel has become a partisan issue in the United States. The Democrats are increasingly sharply divided over policy towards Israel. People are openly lamenting that Biden is prepared to throw away not only his second term, but in their view, the future of the U.S. Political system in order to stand shoulder to shoulder with Netanyahu and Ben Gvir and Smotrich. I think in Europe, the situation is even more dramatic because in many of these countries, you have parliamentary systems where the margins of victory are much more narrow than in a two-party system like the U.S. or the U.K. And what we're beginning to see there is that Israel, devotion to Israel has traditionally been an electoral asset and a political asset, whereas association with the Palestinians, let alone their rights, has traditionally been politically toxic. That is beginning to significantly change. Israel is increasingly becoming a burden to those who support it, and an asset and Palestinians, to a certain extent, also becoming an asset to those who embrace them. So these are admittedly slow-moving changes, but I think of strategic significance. And I think and I do think that in years to come, we may well be looking at these last 8 months as a turning point where these long-term trends began to accelerate and consolidate and shift the direction of Western policy towards the Middle East. And there's also another important factor here, which is that if there is one reason for Western support for Israel that stands out above all the rest, it's the view that Israel is a strategic asset, that Israel is, as it used to be called, the stationary aircraft carrier, that Israel promotes Western interests in the Middle East. They're fighting and dying, so we don't have to. Well, Israel's military incompetence during the last 8 months, its inability to defeat a militia in a postage stamp-sized territory that is the Gaza Strip, is not doing it very much credit. And it'll be very interesting to see, how military planners in the Pentagon and the NATO and some of these other military structures begin to reevaluate their views of Israel on the basis that it's more of a strategic burden than a strategic asset. I mean, all the weapons that the West had intended to send to Ukraine to fight the Russians or hold in reserve for an eventual conflict with China over Taiwan are now all going, or to a very significant extent, to Israel. And it still can't win. So how is it supposed to take on real threats to Western interests in the Middle East when these emerge?
Yeah, that goes back, Mouin and Osama, to what I was saying earlier about the costs that Israel is incurring. It's able to inflict incalculable harm to families, to people, to buildings and universities and everything else, hospitals in Gaza, but it's paying a massive price in all of these terms. The shift in, I've written about this. My last book is partly about this. The shift in support for Israel in Europe and the U.S. used to be a matter of the left. It was always progressive liberal Democrats in the U.S. and the left in general in Europe that supported Zionism and the Israeli project. And now it's increasingly the right. And this is causing a massive crisis in the Democratic political party, and I'm sure in its equivalents in Europe, and a split and possibly the loss of an election and so forth. It's the crisis we're witnessing on our own university campuses to the point where riot police are being called on our students, and donors are trying to call the shots at, and having the presidents of Harvard and Penn fired, and this kind of thing. That's a depth of crisis that cannot easily be dismissed as something. I mean, I think it's all of these things augur a major transition that we're now witnessing. So who knows where we're going to go, from here. I think it's all up for grabs in a way. But I know Karim wanted to come up with a question as well. Karim, are you there?
So I just wanted, Moin, I want to get back since just because for the interest of time, I want to push you a little bit on the regional dynamic a little bit, and get to. So we've been talking about the kind of military and the strategic changes that have happened since October 7th. But it's one of the incredible things that happened on October 7th was this pushing away the attempt or the what I think was already penciled in kind of Saudi-Israeli normalization deal that was going to be the pinnacle of what was meant to be this new kind of Arab-Israeli kind of regional order that in part was kind of set up to sort of antithetical to the Iran and Hezbollah and the axis of resistance. And so, based on what you're saying a little bit earlier, and I agree, and I've been trying to make this argument as well for a while now, which is that for me, the Israelis have been losing militarily. Again, not the question of committing genocide and just killing people and this they're fantastic on. But in terms of achieving military targets like 2006, like even the last couple of Gaza wars, they've gotten less and less able to do so. And this is really the culmination, just showing, as you said, this tiny little area, it totally besieged, including by the Egyptians and everybody else, and unable 7-8 months into this to get any significant military kind of victory. It's really quite extraordinary. So how does this reflect? So from Saudi Arabia, from the Gulf in particular, and the Saudis in particular, what is the calculation? Because as it is, and I know you've written a lot about this, there's a kind of regional configuration that was going on. There was at some point the Saudis reaching out to the Iranians and kind of thawing their relationship, moving towards China, moving towards others in a more multipolar kind of way. How has this changed now, and what happens to normalization?
Well, I think those who have put their hopes on Israel to do their regional dirty work should have probably paid closer attention in 2006 when Israel was being egged on by the United States, by various regional powers, and completely failed. If you remember at the beginning of the 2006 war, Condoleezza Rice was hailing the birth pangs of a new Middle East. Well, it turned out to be an abortion. So I think, that's probably become even more intensified now. I would like to say, though, about Saudi-Israeli normalization, I never took it particularly seriously. And here's why. It wasn't the U.S. trying to broker an agreement between Saudi Arabia and Israel. It was actually a tripartite agreement between the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Israel, in which the primary concessions were not being made by Israel and Saudi Arabia to each other, but rather by the United States to Saudi Arabia in the form of a formal security guarantee and the delivery of a civilian nuclear program. And those are things that the White House cannot do without congressional approval. And I felt, first of all, that the chances of Congress signing on to a formal security guarantee and a civilian nuclear program for a variety of reasons was essentially a non-starter. And secondly, that to consummate this agreement, Israel would also be required to make a number of cosmetic gestures towards a Palestinian Authority and the Palestinians. And for this Israeli government, that was a non-starter as well. Now, I felt that one reason Biden wanted these cosmetic gestures to the Palestinians was because he hoped that it would induce Netanyahu to ditch Ben-Gvir and Smotrich and form an alternative coalition, primarily with the less extreme, more centrist, whatever you want to call it, political party led by Yair Lapid. Well, there's another problem, is that Lapid has been consistently outspoken against any agreement that would deliver a nuclear reactor to Saudi Arabia. So that was a non-starter as well. And I also don't buy all these pundits who were saying that trying to sabotage such an agreement was a primary motivation for Hamas on October 7th. First of all, because it wasn't imminent, as was already clear. And second of all, because Hamas would have understood that no previous Arab-Israeli normalization agreements, whether the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty of 1979 or the 1994 Israeli-Jordanian peace agreement, has ever fallen victim to Israeli massacres of Palestinians. And they would have understood that that this would be no different. What you had more recently was the Saudis proposing to the Americans, okay, let's leave the Israelis out of this. You give us, let's make it a bilateral US-Saudi agreement. You give us the formal security guarantee in the nuclear program, and we'll make all kinds of pledges about continuing to price oil in dollars, about limiting Chinese access to the Saudi market, and other things that under normal circumstances would have been enormously appealing to a government in the United States that sees China as a rival and is trying to limit its global economic role. But the Americans, as ever, went back to the Saudis and said, absolutely not. We're not interested in any agreement, no matter how good it is for the United States, unless it includes Saudi-Israeli normalization. And I think another factor to take in mind is that since, a main incentive for the Saudis had been to bring Israel on board in a more open alliance against Iran. Well, two things happened. First of all, Saudi-Iranian relations are today much less tense than they were a few years ago. And remember, the Chinese brokered Saudi-Iranian normalization agreement. That's the normalization that the Saudis have actually reached. And second of all, given, for example, the Iranian attacks on the Aramco facilities in Saudi Arabia, I believe it was in 2019, the Saudis and other GCC states have become much more aware that should it come to an actual armed conflict, no matter how much they spend on U.S. weaponry, they're going to be essentially defenseless.
So, Mouin, on this point, where we're heading towards a wrap, but I've got a question in terms of trying to figure out this reading that you're drawing for us, this map that you're drawing for us. On the one hand, there's this idea that Israel is losing in a certain kind of way. In Europe, you said, in terms of electorally, it used to be a benefit, and now it's a burden. And in the US, we could see, as you've said, Seti alluded to earlier, there's a shift, no question, there's a huge shift taking place. I would say a generational shift taking place. So those are happening here. But what about regionally in the Arab world itself? Because it seems to me never before has there been such an extraordinary, there's never been a genocide in this way perpetrated before our eyes. And yet the Arab states have done absolutely nothing, essentially nothing. And worse than nothing, they've actually been complicit, right, in this thing,
No, but it's somewhat, sorry, if I could just add to that. It's not just, to go back to what Mouin was saying a minute ago, too, it's not just, of course, Arab states have watched as Palestinians get massacred, but in this case, it's not just now the genocide in Gaza, it's also Israel is violating Egyptian sovereignty, it's violating the Camp David Accord, there's all kinds of things that it's doing, it's new red lines that it's crossing that it hasn't crossed before, which I think that's maybe what you're getting at, that this may lead to different kind of reaction than the standard Arab hemming and hawing. Or was that what you're trying to say too?
Well, no, there's two things. One question for Mouin is this question of the Arab state role, which has been a role of defeated states, essentially, sort of being the water carriers and being sort of the messengers. The messengers of the Israelis and the Americans to the Palestinians to always put pressure on the Palestinians. That seems to be the Arab state role at this point. Is that going to change given this geopolitical dynamic that we're talking about, where Israel is quote unquote losing in a certain kind of way? Is that going to, or are they going to double down on their sort of commitment to this sort of U.S. brokered alliance between Israel and the Arab states at the expense of their peoples? I mean,
yeah, I mean, it's interesting. You look at 1948, where the role of Arab states was considered so scandalous that a number of them were overthrown in subsequent years. Well, say what you want, but in 1948, you actually had King Farouk's Egypt and King Abdullah's Jordan and the Hashemite monarchy of Iraq actively participating in the fighting. In 1982, people make this big deal of Reagan calling Begin and saying, "Stop this Holocaust." Well, the reason he did so was because the Saudi crown prince, Prince Fahd, intervened forcefully with the Americans. And the Americans at the time, this was less than a decade after the 1973 oil crisis, still lived with the memory of that and felt that Saudi concerns needed to be taken into account, or there could be consequences. Now, there is absolutely nothing. Well, unless, the only significant action that has been taken is the Egyptian blockade of the Gaza Strip. And I think I would not expect any changes. I don't know to what extent this is going to lead to significant challenges to these governments in the coming period. It's very difficult to say. I certainly wouldn't count on it. But what we've seen, again, going back to the case of Egypt, of governments only acting when their own national security is directly impacted by Israel's actions, in this case by Israel taking over the border zone between Egypt and the Gaza Strip, and presumably growing Egyptian concerns that Israel may yet find a way to push the population of the Gaza Strip into the Sinai Peninsula. But against that, I think we also have to see the self-styled axis of resistance and its role during the past 8 months, whether Hezbollah or last month's unprecedented Iranian attack launched directly from its territory against Israel in retaliation for Israel's bombing of the Iranian consulate in Damascus. Certainly, what we've been seeing in the Red Sea and the Arabian Sea over the past months. So, if you're talking about the formal Arab state system, I would agree that it's completely bankrupt and beyond redeemable, and I really don't see any changes there. But at the same time, you also have these alternative coalitions, if you will, that not only are much more active, but which the formal Arab state system appears powerless to stop.
Mouin, I think that's a great place to stop. We've gone on for an hour and more, and we really appreciate your coming on the show and talking with us. And we hope to continue the conversation in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you, Mouin.
Thanks, Mouin. Okay, guys, I thought this was really interesting, and we covered actually quite a bit, from the International Criminal Court to the regional politics to what's going on in the U.S. And I thought, in particular, one of the points that Mouin raised was this question that I think we all agree with, which is how the Israelis are losing, what Richard Falk talked about, the legitimacy wars, and that strategically they've become like a bit of this albatross that is becoming increasingly difficult even for their allies to kind of use them, or to they're more of a burden than anything else, right? What do you guys think?
Yeah, I think that's certainly the thrust of what Mouin was saying, that Israel in Europe has become more of an electoral sort of albatross, as you're saying. In the US, obviously, there's what you see now on college campuses, what you see in terms of legislation, what you see in terms of threats to academic freedom, to First Amendment rights, all this on behest of crushing dissent around the question of Israel and the crushing of Palestinian solidarity. So all these things are interesting shifts. On the other hand, and of course the ICC, what he was talking about, the ICC and these sort of unprecedented applications, right, to against Netanyahu and Gallant. This is really unprecedented. So there's something quite new and quite interesting in the midst of a genocide. So the question, Karim and Sari, is ultimately, Mouin was talking about this as well, is how do you make sense of these sort of defeats, in a sense, if that's what we want to call it, for Israel, with the fact that Gaza is being obliterated. This is what we always come back to, and that the Israeli objective was not simply to destroy Hamas, it was to destroy Palestinian life and society in Gaza. And so in that sense, you can't say they're losing on that level.
Well, I think Mouin was making, I think Mouin was making the point, which I think is an interesting point, which is to say that the objective outside of the declared objectives was ethnically cleansing. And so Blinken was dispatched on behalf of the Israelis. Blinken was dispatched to the Saudis and the Egyptians to open that. And when that didn't work, when the Egyptians and the Saudis and the others said no, like the key client said absolutely not, then they moved to part B of the ethnic cleansing, which is to render it totally inhabitable so that it became de facto, there would be ethnic cleansing, they would have to leave. The third option, if we go back to one of our very first podcasts with Ghassan Abu Sitta, and his concern at the time was that once this genocide ends, even if people were not ethnically cleansed in the meantime, that might happen during the so-called humanitarian phase, in the kind of post-war humanitarian phase, that people are kind of taken out and then they'll never be able to go back in. So I think that nuance is interesting and important for us to kind of keep in mind.
For sure. But Sadi, can we get you in on this? I mean, because what I don't understand is what's to stop? I mean, so we have the ICC stuff that Mouin talked about. We talked about with Mouin. But Sadi, what is going to stop the Israelis at this point? I mean, they just seem to be hell-bent on continuing this war. There's absolutely no pressure from the U.S. as far as I can tell. No matter what Israel does, the Americans say, okay, go ahead, do it more. Here's more weapons.
But the thing is, there's a few things. One thing is, I don't think that they knew. I don't think that they had a plan. Like you said, that they had these objectives. They had those declared objectives. I don't think that they really knew what they were getting themselves into. I think that the deeper they got into Gaza, the more they had to keep going, because to retreat would have cost the government its position, basically. So they're kind of stuck in a way. It's not that they have answers to it. Yes, they are lashing out blindly, and they have been now for all these months. And they're destroying and killing and making life impossible and killing children and destroying hospitals and universities. But that's just, first of all, it's partly what they do anyway, although they've never done it to this extent. But that's kind of their MO in general, is to lash out in blind anger. But if we go back, if we connect the dots of this conversation, no matter what we think about Karim Khan, that moment, I mean, that Israel is simultaneously in effect on trial, so to speak. I know it's not technically on trial, but on trial, both in the International Court of Justice.
Yeah, International Court of Justice, Israel.
Both in the International Court of Justice. Hang on, both the International Criminal Court. We're going back to talking about the cost it's paying. It's paying enormous costs. I've never thought, and we talked about this with Stephen Walt last week, I've never thought that, and I'm not alone in saying this, that Israel served a strategic purpose for the U.S. Whatever strategic purpose it once may have served, it certainly no longer serves that purpose today. It's a liability in strategic terms. It's useless for defending anything in the Middle East, as is now manifestly obvious to anyone. So the question is, what keeps Western support going for it? The only thing that has kept Western support going for it is this broad-based sense of legitimacy that it has enjoyed for far too long at a Western kind of electoral, representational, discursive, and political level. That's what kept it. That is its oxygen. That's what allows it to go on doing what it's doing. What it has been doing for the past 8 months, on top of all of the previous years, but especially the last 8 months, is to destroy the basis for its legitimacy in the West. And that is massive and incalculable. It's paying a massive, or it will be paying a massive and incalculable cost. Does it show right now? Not exactly, but the manifestations of it are the campus crises in the US. It is not normal for campuses in America to be shut down.
And Europe, my campus, and by the way, in the European
and Europe, yes, right. But like UC Santa Cruz is now on lockdown again. The strike is going to come to UCLA. Our classes are being pushed online. I mean, this is to have riot police patrolling our campuses. It's not normal. It speaks to a sense of crisis of legitimacy here in the U.S. of our liberal institutions, and it's going to spread in the political system. If Biden loses the election in the fall, even if he doesn't lose the election, there's massive dislocations taking place because, as it came up in our conversation today, support for Israel used to be a matter of the left. It is now a matter of the far right, the ultra right, the card-carrying anti-Semitic white nationalists in America. That's who now.
I disagree. I disagree. I disagree in this sense, in this very particular sense. Not the. You're absolutely right. The right wing, the anti-Semitic white nationalist right wing in this country certainly supports Israel. There's no doubt about it, right? That we know about that. And they're anti-Palestinian, they're anti-immigrant, they're anti-everything.
They're also anti-Jewish.
Of course, they're anti-Semitic. Absolutely, they're anti-Jewish, 100%. But the support for Israel is not. You can't say that Biden represents that. Biden and Blinken, and they don't represent just the right wing. They represent the establishment. The establishment has been overwhelmingly pro-Israel. I mean, it's not just the right wing.
As do our university administrations. It's or the New York Times. It's the conventional wisdom. Do as you've always done. Status quo. And we all know status, whatever the plural of status quos are really hard to dislodge. It's like Newton's law, whichever law that is. A body at motion or rest remains at motion and rest until something moves it. It's very hard to dislodge. The inertia of the status quo is very hard to dislodge. So Biden thinks it's 1981 or 1983 or something like that. He's still stuck in this old way. Blinken, I don't know who knows what he's up to, but and Congress is acting like this is again in the 1980s, but there's an increasing dislocation between at the Democratic spectrum. On the right, it's different, but in the Democratic side of things, there's an incredible dislocation between the status quo maintained by the party elite, like Biden, like Nancy Pelosi, like all those people who are totally out of touch with their base and where the base is going. And I think, yes, for now it's sustainable. These things don't happen overnight, but they portend future dislocations and future transformations that the Israelis are, they may put their head in the ground and pretend that it's not happening. It is happening.
I mean, it's interesting that the base, in a sense, is closer, in fact, to someone like Bernie Sanders than it is to the Biden-Blinken.
As it was in 2016, by the way. And again, the Democratic Party elite is what scuppered Bernie's candidacy in 2016 in favor of the candidate of the establishment, Hillary Clinton. I mean, it's again, the party elite is out of touch with its base at the Democratic level. The Republicans, it's a different story.
I agree with Sadi on that point. I actually agree with you, Sadi, 100%. But Karim, on this ICC ruling or application, how do you read it in terms of the Arab states? I mean, the fact is there seems to be, like Mouin was saying this, and he's right, the culture of impunity of Israel in the West is being eroded. I mean, that's what the Israelis have always had, this impunity. They can do whatever they want, and they're always hiding behind, the narrative sort of formation and fortress that they've had about why their state exists and so on and so forth, all of which is based on being anti-Palestinian. Nevertheless, they've had impunity that's being eroded now. And the ICC decisions, right, tell us that something is being eroded. But how do you read that ICC decision with the fact that the Arab states have battened down their sort of their commitment to a philo-Zionist U.S. architecture of hegemony in the region, even though it's failing, but they're still there. I mean, the Arab states have done absolutely nothing, zero, except be complicit. How do you explain this? An erosion on the West, in the West, there's an erosion on the West.
But discursively, remember, Egypt has now joined in with the ICJ case. And, the Saudis are saying there's not going to be a deal until you...
Did Egypt, by the way, sorry, Karim, did Egypt actually formally do that? Or did they say they're going to do it? Because there's a big difference. I never know when the Arab states say like they're going to do something and then nothing ever happens. What did they actually do?
The point is that in this case, the Arab states, even these kinds of Arab states, are having to say something to placate, if nothing else, to both to placate their own people and the kind of the larger international narrative that clearly has the Israelis on the losing side. And on the other hand, they're gaining some kind of tactical in the negotiations with the Americans, they're extracting concessions out of them. So they're able to do both while not taking the Israelis as the core issue. So they're negotiating with the Americans, and on the other hand, they're trying to placate at the most minimal level, I think, their own audience and the idea of being on the right side internationally in the UN votes and others like this. So you can't say the Arab states, because Algeria is in the Security Council and they've been pushing very hard. You have those countries like Iraq and Lebanon and others that are actually Yemen that are actually at war. So you're talking about the kind of the states that are aligned with the Americans and are not trying to extract as much as they can concessions out of them through the kind of negotiations, through Blinken coming and going. And he's rather a hapless guy. He's rather like, I think Steve Walt said it, right? He's rather disappointing to say the least, and extremely inept in terms of all his so-called shuttle diplomacy going back and forth. He barely gets anything. He tells the Israelis something and they slap him in the face, as they always do. He goes to the Arab countries. He doesn't get anything out of them. So you have this reconfiguration, I think, that's going on. And I think Mouin kind of pointed at it, and I've kind of brought it up in a few of these episodes, where what's interesting, and I think Mouin towards the end said, like, the real normalization has been through the Saudi-Iranian coming together. And that's what's interesting to kind of chart. And I think we need to talk more about that, because that's been happening in the background. That there are ups and downs, but in the background, that has gone forward. And that's separate. And it's interesting that they can see this, that the Saudis are able to kind of go on the Israeli side, but also on the Iranian things. But the Iranian one is actually moving forward. The Israeli one has stalled, and it's not clear how that's going to restart.
Mouin said something very interesting. He said that he never believed that the Saudi-Israeli deal was on the cards. I mean, we were all led to believe. Karim, you said that was in March. You told me last time it was March.
I mean, let's say it's in March. I said my understanding was that it was penciled in for in that period in the spring.
Wait, penciled in by the same people who had said that everything was quiet in the Middle East on October 6th.
But I mean that's exactly it. But one leads to the other. They need to be convinced that everything is fine and the Palestine doesn't really matter and nobody cares, in order for there to have been that normalization. Now, what the Saudis had extracted out of it, that's not clear. So he's making the point, I think, that they even then they were asking for kind of the help of not just a military deal, but the kind of nuclear facilities, and that's something that never would have happened. Who knows? I mean, we'll find out eventually, but I don't think it was as far as Mouin says. I don't know. I mean, that's my impression. But in either case, I think what we can say happened over these past several months is that if there was anything, that's totally scuppered now. Biden has been, and Blinken have put all their eggs into the basket of the Saudis, and it's not going to happen.
Of the Israelis or the Saudis? They put all their eggs in the Israeli basket.
On the deal, on the Saudi-Israeli deal.
The Saudi deal. Yeah, I see your point. Okay, guys, anything else we need to touch on, or Sadi? Any last thoughts?
No, I think that's it. I think that this conversation began and ended with the question of legitimacy and cost. That the Israelis may think that they can get away with just bombing and killing. Bombing and killing in and of themselves are not what win wars. I mean, the Americans killed 3 million people in Vietnam. They still lost the war. They killed God knows how many people in Afghanistan, and they still lost. So Iraq, the sheer capacity to kill people does not translate into the attainment of political objectives, which is the Israelis seem never to have understood that lesson. It's part of their racist blindness. But it's important. And the other thing is, the flip side of it is, it's not just that they're not attaining by pummeling people into the ground. They're paying a massive cost in their Western base of support, their long-term Western base of support, the thing that has sustained them for all of these decades. They're paying a massive price for it, but that's what we touched on, I think, in this conversation.
One last point, Salman, before we close here is again, because I think it's an important thread that we need to pick up, which is the line about armed resistance kind of coming in. Yes, he made the point to my question. He made the point that that option was never completely out. But in reality, in sort of large scale, not individual things, but in sort of large scale, it was effectively out and had been coming increasingly so. And I wasn't talking about Hezbollah and Lebanon. I was talking more within Palestine itself. And that the military option, I think he said the military option is back on the table. And I think it's really important to drive home the point that without that military attack, none of the stuff we've been talking about would have happened, or possibly might not have happened. Normalization might have gone through. The deals would have, very likely would have happened. The regional politics would have been very different. So let's see. Something to think about. So, yeah, thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Indeed. Thank you.